Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm grateful that we all had an extra hour of sleep last night because we're going to need our energy to be cruising through the New Testament. It's going to be a lot of fun. Real quick, we've had a few people ask about why we're jumping over to the New Testament while we've been in the midst of the Old. I believe one of the ideas behind this was that we knew that people weren't going to be able to attend every class throughout the year. At the first Sunday of the month, we're going to be alternating between these Old and New Testament overviews just as a way of, for those who could only make it once a month or so, just as a way to kind of get the wider breadth and understanding of what is in the Bible. So before I jump in, I just want to start by saying part of my goal in doing this is just to familiarize you with the content of what is in the New Testament, but not only the content, but also some of the history behind it, so that as you read on your own, I'm under no illusion that we're going to be able to cover all of the content. This is really, my goal was to help equip you for your own reading and understanding a little bit more about when these books or letters were being written, and a little bit more about some of the history behind that. So with that, I want to start just by talking about what is in the New Testament. And broadly speaking, it breaks down into three different categories. You have, not surprisingly, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You have the Pauline epistles, including some that are debated whether or not they're Pauline, but were traditionally ascribed to Paul based on things within the text itself. And then finally, you have, you could use a lot of different early church authors, early church writings, but these were written by people other than Paul, but for the most part, outside of Acts and Revelations, are letters. These letters would have been things that likely would have circulated amongst churches. Some, like Paul's, were written to very specific communities about very specific issues going on, while others were meant to be circulated throughout churches. And we'll get into a little bit about why that was. So these are all of the various books and epistles that you would find within the New Testament. And so for me, one of the interesting questions then gets into when were these written? And this gets into a little bit of whiplash. It's almost like a movie that's out of sequence to some degree, because even though the Gospels appear at the start, those were not the first things written within the New Testament. And so you have Jesus' life and ministry believed to be around 4 BCE. So this would have been right at the tail end of Herod the Great's life. Unfortunately, Herod and Herod's children were also named Herod, hence some little blurring of lines around when this might have been. But it's widely believed that Jesus was born in the neighborhood of 4 BCE. And then his public ministry really was a kind of whirlwind. We believe it's about 2 to 3 years, roughly around 28 to 30 CE. So after this, Paul's conversion comes a few years later. Scholars believe in the neighborhood of 33 to 36. You have Paul's letters. You'll notice a curious gap here, and we'll get into a little bit of the historical mystery that is that gap period. But Paul's letters are primarily believed to come from just over a decade, so from about 49 to 62 before he goes under house arrest in Rome. You have the Gospels, with Mark being the first written. That's a general consensus among scholars, although you have a few who hold out for Matthew as the first, kind of following sequentially the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John that you see in your Bibles. And then you also have early church writings, many of which are a challenge to date. The letters that we have weren't signed or dated on the top with when they were taking place. And so scholars typically try to make guesses based around topics that were being referred to, around specific pieces of language, whether these texts are kind of referencing or counter-referencing prior writings, as well as other things we just in general know about the historical time from whether it's Roman records, Jewish records, or otherwise. And so it's a tricky thing, and you'll see as we go through all the individual books, sometimes there's a wide range of dates. And as I've said before in this class, the dates are mainly to help us understand the general time period. I've always found whether a book was written in, even if you say 80 to 110, sure, it was a different historical context, but at the end of the day, please don't let that question occupy your mind too much. It's mainly just to help root us in the time frame. There are also other early church writings that didn't make the canon, and we're going to get into in a second how the church canon formed. One of the most mysterious ones, this wasn't actually discovered until shortly after World War II. Some of you may have heard of Nag Hammadi, a big kind of treasure trove of documents that was discovered. The Gospel of Thomas is not a gospel as we would think of it. It is what's known as a sayings gospel, where there's absolutely no narrative, but they're all purported words from Jesus. Now, one of the tricks with dating this, you see a massive range of 40 to 140. There seem to be elements of overlap between the Gospel of Thomas, some of what is in there within the Gospels that may reflect early church tradition. There's also things within the Gospel of Thomas that very clearly come from the 2nd century, primarily with connections to, some of you may have heard of the Gnostic Gospels, this kind of knowledge cult. In the Gospel of Thomas, there are very clearly connections to that, but there's questions about, well, how much were these things added on to an existing corpus versus how much was this just compiled at the start? And so this kind of remains something of a historical mystery. But what is known is that many of the early church fathers and other early church writers didn't really seem to hold the Gospel of Thomas in very high regard at all. And so that remains part of this reason why some scholars date it so late, is the church often leaned towards the earlier a document, the more likely it was to be included in the canon. You also have First Clement. So Clement was the bishop of Rome, otherwise known by the Pope. He was the 4th in the line of succession, but really, for all intents and purposes, was kind of the first pope as we would know it. There's kind of a developing hierarchy from Peter and a few others. But Clement was a very influential figure in kind of this turn of the century period, and wrote a letter which survives but was not ended up being included in the canon because others at the time of the formation didn't see his words as being universal. It was a little too specific. And finally, you have the Didache, which is a fascinating document that essentially is the establishment of many different church rules and practices. It's one of our best windows into what baptism or communion or these kind of other liturgical pieces look like in the early church. This document was known for centuries, but wasn't found until actually this past century. It was referred to by other early church documents, but no one had ever found it or read it. And there was a great archaeological discovery in which found it. So worth a read if you ever have the time. So real quick, I'd love to get into how these books came into being. Now, there was outside of Paul's letters, there was a significant delay between Jesus's ministry and when the events of this began to be recorded. Some have found that bizarre, and I agree it is bizarre thinking about it the way that we do. But as it says here, I can't overemphasize how much oral tradition was the primary means of conveying the gospel back in Jesus' time. It's estimated that 10% or less of people knew how to write and read. And it may have even been more skewed when you get into Christianity was sort of most prominent in lower classes and where it had the most spread. So in all likelihood, there maybe would have been 1, 2 people within a church community who had the ability to read and interpret. This oral tradition and being passed down was for decades the way in which Jesus' message was communicated. We think about Paul as a great writer, and indeed he was, but within his text, occasionally you'll see him add a little superscription at the end, talking about Paul, see with what large letters I'm writing. It's widely believed that Paul had hired a professional scribe known as an amanuensis, and that this figure would have changed based on the letter or where he was. The large letters he refers to means that he probably didn't have great handwriting. He wasn't a professional writer. He would dictate his letters to someone who would then copy them down. Now, this gets into a whole host of other questions in that the grammar in Paul's letters, or 7 of his letters, are very consistent. Other letters which are attributed to him are different. Does that mean the scribe was not verbatim copying down his words and putting it in his or her own diction? Possibly. But this idea of even someone who we would have thought as a prolific writer was actually leaning on someone else's help in order to write these letters. And then many people believe that part of the reason why you start to have the Gospels start to be written down is you have this generation of disciples, Peter, Paul, others, start to die. And there was this need to carry on and preserve this tradition as firsthand witnesses were no longer able to share what they had seen. And so that's part of why these began to be written down. So you have all of these pieces of oral tradition, as well as other, there are certainly short documents. I referenced the Gospel of Thomas already, but it's believed that many of the Gospels may have been using these sort of short sayings Gospels of just words that would have been attributed to Jesus, and that they were trying to synthesize a wide swath of tradition into a more cohesive whole. In fact, if you read in Luke and Acts, that's essentially what Luke is saying that he's doing, is there is a huge thing. I'm trying to present you with a very orderly, detailed depiction of what Jesus' life and ministry was like. So occasionally these pieces are edited, and as you read through the biblical text, you'll sometimes see a few seams of kind of whiplash between locations. But for the most part, the gospel authors are able to put Jesus' life and ministry in a very clear and consistent kind of trajectory. Acts, there's a fascinating thing, if you ever read through the book of Acts, there's this sudden shift of what was once a third person, kind of omniscient. All of a sudden, we get a first person narrative of sailing that is truly bizarre if you read it. There's no introduction whatsoever. We just suddenly switch from the third person to the first person. It's widely believed that this would have been just a surviving piece of someone's journey that was incorporated by Luke, rather than changing it all, just incorporated right into the text. And so you have kind of this tension between how much these original accounts were edited. We'll get into Matthew and Luke, kind of shed a little bit into that. And I'm sorry, I know I'm going really fast. I wanted to cover, I want to cover the entirety, and so, all right. So, Luke and Acts were written by the same person, hence why they're so alike, yes. So, Luke and or someone, it remains a mystery. So, if you look at this chart, it's, again, don't want to get too bogged down in the numbers. This is I think, a really interesting representation of how much is shared between what are called the synoptic gospels. So Mark, Luke, and Matthew, you see this purple, what's called triple tradition. It really seems, from all that we could tell, that both Luke and Matthew were aware of Mark and were using Mark. I see somebody, I'll send this out, I promise, because yeah, I know it's so small. But this sort of shared tradition really makes it clear that both Matthew and Luke look to Mark as sort of an important source of kind of helping to put that together. But you'll also notice that there are some interesting pieces here that are clearly from different traditions. So you have Mark and Matthew. There's a good portion, roughly a sixth of Mark, is shared with Matthew but isn't reflected in Luke at all. And in a similar way, you see Matthew and Luke have this tradition that came to be known as the Q source, that are teachings from Jesus that don't appear in Mark, but are almost verbatim the same in Luke and Matthew. And knowing that these were written in different contexts, how could that be? Most scholars assume that there was this previous oral tradition, and the tradition that's here is only sayings, that there was something like this, what's called Q document, like the Gospel of Thomas, that was just short sayings from Jesus that both Matthew and Luke were aware of and were able to use. You'll see Luke, and this gets even more unique when we get into John, but you'll see Luke, over a third of Luke is unique to Luke. Those of you who have read through it will know some of our kind of best loved parables, Parable of the Good Samaritan, the Prodigal Son. Those parables don't appear in any of the other Gospels outside of Luke. Luke seems to have had access, or his community had access, to a wide-ranging amount of parables from Jesus that other communities weren't aware of. And so you have all these different shared sources. For me, it's just kind of interesting in thinking, how do we go from oral tradition about Jesus spread across a massive swath of area into a cohesive whole? And for me, I know for some people, you get a little nervous about, well, why do some of these things kind of not have reflections in other Gospels? Does that mean that they're not true or that they're inaccurate? For a while, that bothered me until I had a professor who talked to me about, I guess I'll ask you, nominate something that happened about 50 years ago in the world. Any ideas? Something that would have been really newsworthy, noteworthy. Okay, so Sputnik.
Yeah, landed on the moon.
Or yeah, let's say landed on the moon. Now let's say all of us took the time to think back well, I guess we have the benefit of the internet today, so that doesn't really help. Imagine that the internet didn't exist, you could talk to other people, but all of us would write down our account of what happened. My assumption is that our accounts, there'd be some stuff that was similar. Most of it would look drastically, well, not drastically, but would look different. And I think for me, just because each of us remember or hold specific things doesn't mean that, or like something that we might have noticed or written down isn't reflected in others, doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just the curious way that A, human memory works, and B, all of us bring different emphases or things that we feel are important. And I'm going to spend a little time getting into what each of these gospel writers felt was important. Yes?
Do we know Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where they were physically?
Right? Unfortunately, no, although there have been some, sorry, Fred, I know I'm moving out of frame. There have been some attempts, and it's primarily around guesses around what audience they're writing to, and I'll get into a little of that when we get into the individual Gospels. For example, Mark really seems to be writing to a Greek/Gentile audience, and so because of that and a few other clues, there's some guesses as to locations, as to where he may have been. Specifically, not really, unfortunately. And in the same vein, Matthew appears to have been writing to a Jewish audience. Does that mean that he was writing to kind of the Jewish diaspora after Jerusalem was destroyed, and there were a few specific communities where that was kind of most primary? Maybe. But unfortunately, it's kind of one of those things that, while it matters a lot, is lost to history, and I don't know if we'll ever get a great window into where that might have been.
Matthew has the ancestors of Jesus.
He does, and that's very important. Although Luke has it as well. So.
I think that this is because for the first time, I think I know now why Jesus was Jewish, because he had those ancestors.
Sure. Yeah, well, and a lot of shared tradition. So, so in terms of why these particular 27 books became the New Testament and not others, some of you may have read or heard, I think this reached its heyday in, what was it, the Da Vinci Code, with the Dan Brown novel, talking about how there was this kind of secret cabal of people who were putting not true, just tossing that out there. It is true, however, that the New Testament canon wasn't completely fixed in terms of what you would pick up and read in the New Testament today. That kind of authoritative list did not exist until the 4th century. This is seen, so there are two really, really important manuscripts that we have kind of copies of, but are really influential in terms of this particular time period seems to have been when biblical consensus really honed in. The Codex Vaticanus, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Revelation, all 5 of those don't appear within the Codex Vaticanus. They do, however, appear in the Codex Sinaiticus. which was maybe as recently as 10-ish years after this one, made in different locations, to be fair. But the Codex Sinaiticus seems to be kind of a really, really honing down. But when you get into pieces of the canon that weren't fixed, these 5 are actually the ones that pop up most frequently as ones who are kind of drop on and off lists of kind of church fathers' authoritative books. And we'll get into a little, there's actually some level of doubt, extreme doubt, around 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, whether or not they were written by Paul. They purport to be written by Paul, but even early church fathers are saying, A, this doesn't sound anything like Paul, and B, the content is very different. So 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Philemon, curiously enough, is an undisputed letter from Paul. However, it's a very specific situation between an escaped slave and a master. There's some level of thought as to early church fathers saying, is this an important enough book to be kind of a universally accepted and shared thing? And then Revelation has always been something of a curiosity, I'm sure for many of us as well. Revelation and another kind of apocalyptic book, The Shepherd of Hermas, the two of them kind of drop on and off lists, and that appears to be one of the later books as well to be kind of accepted into the canon. So having said all this, the Gospels, the 4 Gospels that we know, and Paul's writings, even from church fathers' writings in kind of the early to mid 2nd century, there's already a pretty clear consensus. There's some belief that Paul's letters were already kind of packaged and being circulated, perhaps even by as early as the end of the 1st century, so that these were already seen as very authoritative. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those Gospels are over and over referred to. I know I had mentioned the Gospel of Thomas. When discussing Gospels, the church fathers over and over say there's 4 and only 4. And it really, from very early on, seemed to be these were seen as kind of the 4 authoritative windows into Jesus' life and ministry.
How would you...
So, all right, real quick, Sue. Sorry, I know you've had a lot of questions so far. I'm hoping to keep going.
No, John, I just wonder how you'd explain that John is different from the Synoptic Gospel.
I will explain it, I promise. Okay. But yeah, we got a lot of ground to cover. So the Muratorian fragment, which was an archaeological discovery, was at the end of the 2nd century, had almost the entirety of the New Testament listed out in terms of the book. So it was really, when you hear about this canon kind of being in flux, it was, but it also wasn't to some degree. There was a pretty clear consensus around what was worthwhile to be shared within the early church. The clear and definitive list comes from a guy named Athanasius, who wrote all down, may have even participated in suppressing some of the ones that didn't make that list. I won't put that on him, but there's kind of a crackdown on the biblical canon after him. But the reason why all of these books were chosen, and again, back to this question of Philemon, is that they needed to have universal value for anyone reading. While some of Paul's letters are obviously very specific to a community, there's also universal value in those teachings, and some of the problems that Paul is writing about are problems that churches have been having since time immemorial. And the other piece that was really important was that these dated back to the early church. You see this particularly as we get into the kind of 120s, 130s, 140s. Church fathers had some level of suspicion about something being written recently and whether that should be included within this canon. Being an early writing was always a surefire way to get better consideration. So, pivoting a little bit back to the Gospels. We already talked a little bit about the oral accounts, but I would love to take now just a little bit of time to get into each of these Gospels' particular emphases that they bring, talking back to the moon landing and how all of us write that different. All of these Gospel writers had particular questions that they were kind of wrestling with, presumably questions that their community was asking once upon a time, that they address in ways that other Gospels don't. The other thing that I think is important to know is much as we may want to have more historical details, these Gospels weren't being written as histories or biographies. One of the kind of noteworthy things is we would all love to know more about Jesus' early life, and we have tantalizingly few details. Matthew and Luke are the only ones who really bother including about Jesus' early life, whereas a modern biography would be preoccupied with how what happened to someone growing up influenced who they were. Wasn't a thing back then. People were mainly just interested in that person's adult life and ministry. And if you read, honestly, even if you read in Matthew and Luke, the details that make up the bulk of those first couple of chapters aren't even necessarily about Jesus. I mean, they are, but you think about Luke, you have Mary's Magnificat, you have Zechariah, you have Simeon. A lot of what it is talking about what Jesus means rather than about Jesus himself. And same goes for Matthew. Matthew, the bulk of the first chapter is this lengthy genealogy. What's being communicated isn't really about Jesus' early life. It's about the lineage and where that he comes from and why that's important. And so it has adult sensibilities in mind. Luke is the only one who even includes a story from Jesus' adolescence. So it's a fascinating thing that we would love more of, but is limited just because the gospel writers didn't see it as important. So to go to the Gospel of Mark, the one that many believe is the first one written. It is believed to have been written, this one is probably the most datable, primarily because of a few passages that seem to reference a sort of ongoing destruction of Jerusalem. I believe it's in Mark 13, although don't quote me on that. There's a passage that talks about the desolating sacrilege. There is a period of time in which there's a Jewish rebellion against Rome. Rome cracks down on it, and between 66 and 70, the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is kind of scattered. It was a really traumatic moment. And Mark, in a few places, like I think it's Mark 13, show kind of, it sounds as if this is something that is currently going on. It may also be an occasion, or kind of an occasioning for which this gospel is being written, is to address like, hey, there's this massive destruction. The church within Jerusalem is under threat, and indeed would eventually be truly under threat. It may have come from this very specific time period. Now, having said that, most assume of all of the Gospels that Mark seems most to be writing to a Gentile audience. The reason why this is occasionally Jewish customs, such as washing hands or other things, get explained in parentheticals in Mark. If this was writing to a Jewish audience, there's absolutely no reason why we would need explanations as to why someone who's Jewish would wash their hands before eating. And this pops up over and over again throughout Mark. And so many assume that he was writing to an audience that wouldn't have been familiar with these kind of first century Jewish customs. The other piece that seems to be really, really important to Mark, and in fact, the bulk of Mark is spent on the kind of final week of Jesus' life and the road to the cross and Jesus' death and resurrection, with the original ending being a little bit strange in Mark. I'll tell you about that later. But Mark is really, a lot of his gospel is about kind of resetting understandings of what a Jewish Messiah should be. Over and over, you have this emphasis on being a Messiah wasn't a sort of triumphal military view of overthrowing Rome. To be the Messiah was to suffer and die and be resurrected. That's what a Messiah is. And that goes against a more widely held view within first century Judaism at the time. So a lot of Mark's gospel is really focused on explaining, well, why, if Jesus was the Messiah, why did his ministry end with him dying on a cross? and that seems to be one of the big kind of animating principles for him. The Gospel of Matthew, Matthew over and over is referring back to the Old Testament and kind of quoting, alluding, but most importantly about how Jesus fulfills various scriptures within the Old Testament. For him, he returns to that again and again and again. And so because of that, most scholars assume that his audience must have been concerned about these things, and ergo Jewish. You'll note if you ever read through Matthew 1 and 2, Jesus, from Herod's similarity to Pharaoh, to the fact that Mary and Joseph, after escaping, go to Egypt and then leave Egypt, there's this very clear intentionality around shaping Jesus to be like Moses. But then as we continue to go, it's clear that Jesus is greater than Moses. But Matthew does a lot that we don't see in any of the other Gospels to set up Jesus as kind of this second Moses figure. But essentially what case Matthew's making is that Jesus is now a replacement for the capital L law, the Torah, and that is kind of one of the purposes of his ministry. Matthew was also, probably more than any of the other gospel writers, really good at combining and synthesizing material and making a cohesive whole. The Sermon of the Mount, which we read in Matthew 5 through 7, that the content that is in the Sermon on the Mount appears in Luke, but it's all chopped up and distributed and is in different places in Luke, whereas Matthew has this as all part of one address. Now, was it delivered as one address? Certainly may have been. It's kind of one of those historical mysteries to some degree. But occasionally Matthew's combining gets to the point of kind of ridiculousness. Some of you who, if you ever read back through Hebrew poetry, if you look through the Psalms, a really common poetic practice was to restate something using similar but different language. And so when we look back on Palm Sunday to a passage about Jesus riding in, back in the Psalms it talks about he will ride in on a donkey, and then again it repeats with another line, he will ride in on a foal, the colt of a donkey. So the other Gospels see this kind of Hebrew poetic parallel for what it is, and Jesus rides in on one animal. Matthew, however, Jesus, we'll never know how, is said to ride in on both a donkey and a foal at the same time.
A donkey and a what?
A donkey and a colt.
Oh, colt, yeah.
Now, did he alternate? Was he riding two at once? It's one of these bizarre things, but for Matthew, one of his really important things was that Jesus is fulfilling the scripture in any way, every way, even if that sometimes means things that don't truly make a ton of sense. And so that's kind of one of Matthew's hallmarks. And yeah. The Gospel of Luke is believed to have been written roughly in the same time as Matthew, but is definitely being written to a different audience, particularly if you take Acts into mind as well. Acts has the writing to Theophilus in the beginning, kind of has this Greek emphasis from the start that this is more looking, and even, the most important thing is really the theme in Luke and Acts is that Jesus' ministry wasn't just about Judaism and Jerusalem, it was universal. When we think about the Good Samaritan, there's this message of this is bigger than just for one people. This is for all humankind. The other thing that we see popping up again and again throughout Luke is very interested in the treatment of the poor and the oppressed. If you think back to in Mary's Magnificat, in Zechariah, in Simeon, all of the language around Jesus' arrival is about this kind of flip that's going to occur, a kind of social reordering. And then that becomes even more pronounced when you think about Acts and descriptions of the early church community, how everyone gave and shared everything that they had, and there was no poor among them. For Luke, it's extremely important that our faith is backed up by our relationship with our possessions, and it's done so in a way that provides for others within the community. And then finally we get to John. So John is sometimes known as the Maverick Gospel in that a lot of what is read in John is completely without parallel in the three others, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For those of you who have read through it, that's not a surprise. It is remarkably different in tone and in content. But one of the things I always say is that, again, that doesn't mean that John is somehow wrong or that it should be dismissed. Quite the opposite. Within John, there's a very clearly developed Christology, or kind of understanding of what Christ means. But many believe that that just reflects the kind of decade or two extra of time, that there is kind of this continually developing understanding of what Christ meant and what his ministry meant. If you think back to the opening of John, talking about Jesus as kind of the pre-existent word, compared to the start of the other Gospels, I mean, what a jarring difference that is. So John, as far as we can tell, seems to have had sources that neither Matthew, Mark, or Luke were aware of. The signs and miracles document is kind of a speculative thing among scholars, but there are all sorts of miracles that Jesus does. You think about the wedding in Cana is one that pops to mind right at the start of John, that have no parallel in others. But there seems to be, based on verbal tics, this kind of clearly established tradition through them all. Most believe that it must have been part of a document that John had access to. The other thing that's very different, particularly when we get to the kind of Maundy Thursday time period, is Jesus' lengthy discourses. If you read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, for the most part, Jesus' speeches are pretty short. Jesus has a lot to say. And again, this gets into a more highly developed understanding of who Jesus was in that time period. John also has, whereas Jesus' divinity appears in kind of offhand ways within Mark and Luke and Matthew, primarily around the Son of God and Son of Man terms, you get this made incredibly explicit within the Gospel of John, that Jesus is God. And that kind of equating is something that's made very clear within John's Gospel. The final piece is that many believe that this Gospel of John came from what's known as the Johannine Community, that this was a very particular community that also produced 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John from later in the New Testament. Maybe the same author, although many disagree with that. But at the very least, it probably came from the same community, given some of the same shared concerns. And then Revelation, some have connected in the past. Revelation is written by John of Patmos. There were some who wondered, well, is that John the same as the John from the Gospel? Unfortunately, John was an incredibly common name in the 1st century. It does not seem as though that author came from that community as well, but just wanted to mention that. Now, as we continue moving forward, looking into the book of Acts and the early church, again, this was written by Luke. The book of Acts covers ground from Jesus' ascension, so in the neighborhood of 30, to Paul's house arrest in Rome, kind of towards the start of the 60s. During this time, we see early Christianity's spread and growth. Again, looking back, probably say 3 decades or so back in time, as Luke reflects on this early Christian movement and explosion. It is fascinating that Luke doesn't talk about Paul's death at all. We leave Paul in house arrest at the end of Acts. When Luke was writing this, surely he would have known what happened to Paul. But unfortunately, because of that, we don't exactly know how and when Paul died. There are kind of these apocryphal tales about what happened to him. Same goes for Peter. Same goes for James the Just that we'll get into. This whole wave of early church leaders kind of just disappear into history, and it's frustrating as someone who wants to know more about this. But for whatever reason, Luke didn't want to end the book of Acts with that. And then the other thing that has long fascinated scholars is that a lot of the second half of Acts is also covered occasionally with overlap between Paul's letters, that we have these sort of firsthand documents by Paul along with a sort of third-person narrative being written by someone in a different time and community. And it's interesting to see the overlaps between the two. So in terms of Paul, in general, what he was doing was writing to early churches that he had helped to plant and develop. The particular circumstances in these, again, are kind of lost to time. But in general, Paul is writing these to instruct these early communities who would have been, by and large, Gentiles who had little to no relationship with Judaism or perhaps even knowledge of Judaism, as well as we have the benefit of being able to go to church and hear a preacher, to read our Bible. These early communities didn't have that. They to some degree were kind of learning on the fly from itinerant preachers like Paul and others. They were reliant on that sort of instruction, hence why you have Paul and others traveling around so much, writing letters for instruction. These things were vital. This was the way for the church to grow. So in terms of Paul's letters, scholars believe that 1 Thessalonians, and these are in the order of when they're believed to have been written, 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, 2 Corinthians, and Romans were all written by Paul. They share a lot of similarities with one another, not even just in terms of the writing style, but in what the arguments Paul is making. There's three particular letters from Paul that are debated and to many degrees are kind of split 50-50 among scholars about whether or not Paul wrote these, including ones that are kind of beloved in Colossians and Ephesians. I don't know that 2 Thessalonians is beloved, but it's still important. The kind of underlying theology, and then you see this word eschatology on here, which is an understanding of the end times. There seems to be a pronounced shift that takes place as the century goes on. So in these early letters, particularly if you read 1 Thessalonians, Paul emphasizes over and over again, I think that's the Thief in the Night book, that the second coming is coming when you least expect it. Get ready, it's going to happen. Within Colossians, Thessalonians, and Ephesians, there's this change in tone about the second coming isn't going to happen within our lifetimes. This is sort of a future event. Now, you could make the perfectly valid argument that Paul's thinking shifted over time. I don't know who among us hasn't changed our thinking over time. However, there's also a lot of other markers with Colossians. It's a very different writing style, not only just with the grammar, but the way that sentences and the arguments unfold that is very un-Pauline. And then in Ephesians, one of the things that we often remember in reading Paul's letters, there's a lot of tell so-and-so X, greet so-and-so, give them a holy kiss. Ephesians is one of the most kind of impersonal and doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table in terms of connections. And so scholars have seen varying degrees of, well, that may just mean that it was meant to be circulated among a very wide community versus others who see that as not representative of Paul's writing. And then already referenced 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus are said to be written by Paul. However, and this gets into part of the trick of identifying biblical books, it was a semi-common practice back in ancient times to, when you needed someone's authority, if you wanted something you wrote to be read, to claim being under the kind of tutelage of someone, but you wrote under their name. That causes a whole host of issues, but it was very common practice back then. You see, if you read through some of the other discoveries, you hear people writing under the name of Adam. You hear people writing under the name of David. Well, obviously they're not, but they sort of claim this sort of authority. And so 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus all read very similar, and it's thought that this probably was one of Paul's close disciples, maybe Timothy himself, although some of the concerns that pop up within these books seem to point to a later time. I can't remember if I have this on a slide for later, but 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus all kind of have this much more developed understanding of church and church structure in a way that, if you read through Paul's writings, doesn't really exist. If you think about it, Paul is starting these churches kind of on the fly, and there's a lot of kind of organizing in this time. And when you have in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, elders, deacons, it's kind of like, okay, well, there's this established church structure that wasn't really present under Paul's time. You also get, I think, I don't want to misquote this now. All right, I'm just going to pass by a detail. And then you also have others which we know that Paul wrote, but unfortunately are just lost to history. There's specific reference to 2 other letters to the Corinthians that we know that we don't have. They're lost to time. There's another letter to the Ephesians that is lost to time. And then this one is interesting, the Laodiceans. This was actually, that letter was included on some of the early church fathers' lists of kind of authoritative books of the New Testament. But it disappears, and no one's ever found a copy of it, have no idea what's in it. But we do know that that was another community that Paul was actively involved with and writing to. In terms of the order that you'll see, some of you may have wondered why Romans is the first, and we kind of walk back. As far as anyone could tell, it seems to have been done based on the length of the books rather than when they were written. And that's everyone's best guess. In terms of other writings that you'll see as you look through the New Testament, one of the more interesting ones is the book of James. You'll see a big time range of when this may have been. So James is, and James, the brother of Jesus, is a really important leader within the early church, primarily focused on Jerusalem and kind of what we would know as the sort of Jewish Christian movement. James's book seems to reflect a lot of that sort of Jewish Christian understanding, meaning that Christianity and Jewish practice should be closely aligned with one another. James is probably most famous for Martin Luther hated it and wanted it to be removed from the canon. Ultimately, he decided not to. But his hatred of it came from this kind of relationship between faith and works, and how for Luther, faith was the primary thing. In James talks about faith without works is dead. And there's kind of this seeming contradiction there that really rankled Luther. So one of the questions becomes, when was this written? Was it written by James in the early church? Many scholars lean towards no, but the content that is in there sounds similar to what we know of James. James seems to address some of the political unrest going on in Jerusalem. You heard me mention earlier from 66 to 70, there was a kind of uprising that led to a crackdown from Rome. Portions of James seem to have an understanding of that as well, so was it written in the 60s? But then it also, again, gets into this referencing church structures. Towards the end of the book, it talks about, are any sick? Well, you should have one of the church deacons go pray with them. Okay, well, that's strange. That doesn't totally check out with the time period, so did that come from later? It's one of the trickier books to figure out when it comes from. Same goes for the book of Hebrews, widely kind of believed to be one of the best written Greek writings within the New Testament. It never specifies an author. For the first couple of centuries, it was connected to Paul, but even as soon as kind of the 3rd and 4th century, people were starting to say that this A doesn't sound like Paul at all, and B doesn't purport to be written by him, so it clearly came from someone else. But it's a really well-founded argument that is seemingly addressing Jewish Christians and explaining to them and making the case for why Christ is the Messiah. Jude, as well, is another that would be in this sort of Jewish Christian family, and is a really kind of scathing, short little letter. It's a fun little read if you want to. It's only a chapter that's addressed about not listening to false teachers within the community. I already covered 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus a little bit. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John is again, 2nd and 3rd John are very short, but these come from a community that seems to have been experiencing persecution. Now, we'll get into when I flip through the timeline in a few minutes. It's not entirely clear, outside of maybe a little patches under Nero and under the Emperor Domitian at the very, very tail end of the 1st century. We don't have great historical records of persecution by Romans. The real persecution comes a century later. But it's clear that something was going on within this community, that they were experiencing persecution. The other thing that pops up that helps to date is this concept of Docetism, which was a belief from you could almost call it kind of like a proto-Gnostic belief that Jesus wasn't actually a human being, that he was spirit only, and that he didn't have a physical body. Now, the reason why 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, they multiple times, especially 1st John, makes reference to Jesus' physical body. And if you think back to the Gospel of John, it's the only one that records doubting Thomas and the physically touching his hands. Many believe that the Gospel of John and these letters are addressing this belief in Docetism, whether it's within their community or whether it's a group that's kind of advocating for their view.
Like Unitarian.
Sure, I guess you could make a loose connection there.
Yeah, which believe that Jesus was
Yeah.
human.
Yeah, and then the last one would be Revelation, which is really kind of a book unto itself, although the genre wasn't unknown within the context of when the Bible is being written. It falls under the genre of apocalypse, which that word means a sort of unveiling or revelation. You could say in some ways this is sort of like a relationship to the prophets once upon a time, in that they received a direct vision from God and then shared and set out that vision for the people. Written, most would assume, although there's always those literalists out there in the world, but most assume that this is being written in sort of metaphor and coded language. Some of the codes, scholars have guesses on it based on different manuscripts. For example, the infamous 666 that you've probably heard of seems to be a connection to the Emperor Nero, based on how we understand Hebrew numbers. So back in Hebrew times, specific letters were connected to specific numbers. And what really helped make this connection was that Nero was also spelled as Neron. And so the N in Hebrew is connected to the value of 50. And in other ancient documents that we found, kind of early copies of Revelation, it was 616 referencing this instead of 666. So you subtract 50 if you spell Nero versus Neron, that N that equaled 50 may have been the connection. But again, who knows? That's going way down the Bible code road that we don't necessarily need to go down. But I just share that as an interesting historical tidbit. It does seem, and you'll see a tighter range on this than almost any other. Most read a lot of the references that are being made, as I mentioned Domitian earlier, is the first Roman emperor under which we do start to see sort of systemic persecution. And it seems fairly clear that whoever wrote Revelation was experiencing this sort of systematized, I'm falling over my words, this sort of systematized, I don't know why. Thank you, my goodness. Whew. All right, home stretch. So just to kind of help sum up in our final minutes, I was thinking this would be helpful of just kind of tracking through how we see Christianity unfold within that first century. So here we go. So we have Jesus' public ministry from a period of about 28 to 30. You have Pentecost and the Great Commission around the year 30. In the 30s, you have Peter, who Gospels look back to as sort of this important leader, and he was for sure. But fascinatingly, James, the brother of Jesus, who we hear sparingly within the Gospels, actually becomes the most important leader within Jerusalem and kind of the sort of quote-unquote Jewish Christian movement there at the time. He's also possibly known as James the Just, James the Less, and I think there's one other name, which lends to a lot of confusion among scholars who aren't entirely sure that these people are all the same. However, James the brother of Jesus is kind of, that and James the Just seem to be the same. James the Less is an unknown. In any case, those two are very important of this kind of centralized Jerusalem church, an early church. You have Paul's conversion approximately around 33, and then he departs for Arabia, which we have absolutely no knowledge of what happened, what he was doing there, what he learned there. It's kind of this mysterious kind of 3-year window of Paul's life immediately post-conversion that we'll never know. But afterwards, Paul travels to meet with Peter and James in Jerusalem, and they seem to hammer out sort of an early understanding that will later be formalized about Paul's mission to the Gentiles and to spread outside of Jerusalem. By the year 40, we have varying degrees of evidence that Christianity has spread beyond Jerusalem to cities like Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Thessalonica, Cyprus, Crete, Alexandria, and Rome. And the big issue that began to pop up, and we'll see both James and Peter and Paul and others start to wrestle with, is what is the relationship between Christianity and Jewish observance and observance to Jewish law? If you think about it, Jesus himself was an observant Jew. For Peter and James, they seem to have this emphasis on keeping and maintaining the law. And then you have Paul and others who seem to emphasize, no, Jesus' coming meant something completely new and different. And there's some of these disagreements that seem to be taking place in this time. Also in this time, in possibly even earlier than the 40s, you have these sort of proto-creeds. This is before the Apostles' Creed. I pulled this one up because I think this might be one of the oldest portions of the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 15, this is Paul writing to this Corinthians community. I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which you stand and through which you are being saved, if you hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed to you. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scripture, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. And then he appeared to James, and then to all of the apostles. So the reason why this is so important is that this doesn't, sound much like Paul, but it's prefaced by this clear reverence that he has for this particular kind of formulation. Scholars assume that this functioned as a sort of early creed, a statement of belief that may date even to within a few years of the start of this early Christian movement about the basics, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried and raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. This may have been one of the early statements of faith and one of kind of the early delineating markers about what it meant to be Christian as the church began to grow. In the year 48, there was an incredibly important council in Jerusalem meeting, and I know we're right at the end of our time, in which James, who represented sort of a closer adherence to Judaism, and Paul, who is kind of the more, we're setting the law aside. There was this kind of meeting of the minds in Jerusalem, and the outcome was a validation of Paul's ministry to the Gentiles, as well as a general non-observance of Jewish law. One of the things that was under debate here was circumcision, and whether or not someone who was Christian needed to be circumcised in accordance with Jewish law. There were other pieces too, but that was kind of the big prompting of all this. After that, you see this explosion in Paul's letters. Many believe that Paul's first letter to the community in Thessalonica came from 49. Paul's ministry continues to expand. Peter as well is really a prominent leader within the church in Antioch and later in Rome. That time in Rome is looked back to now as him being the first bishop of Rome, even though that position, as stated, wasn't really a thing, but it is looked back to now as kind of the start of the papacy. Around 64, both Peter and Paul are believed to have put to death in Rome, although we don't, again, this all remains something of a historical mystery. They just kind of drop off the map, and we have nothing but kind of anecdotal tales about what happened to them. Same deal, in 66, there was an uprising in Rome that led to a crackdown and a destruction. James, Jesus' brother, may have been killed during this time period. There are some other sources that list his death in 62. Regardless, the 60s were this time when all of these important leaders within the early church began to die off. And so you see this sort of explosion in church writings in this time as people start to set down this oral tradition, or continue to set down. Obviously, Paul was writing letters. Jerusalem's destruction also leads to an important shift within the quote-unquote center of Christianity. Up until that point, Paul and others, even for those for whom the Gentile ministry is important, they always reference going back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem seems to have been the center, but after Jerusalem is destroyed, there's this shift towards Rome's importance. You have the early popes Linus and Cletus. Gotta love Pope Cletus. So those two are the second and third. They sort of mark this sort of consolidating of power to some degree. The Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, becomes an incredibly important and influential figure within this growing global Christianity. You also, in the 70s and beyond, start to hear hints of tension and separation between Jews and Christians. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not something that's widespread, and there's even evidence that Jews and Christians worshipped alongside one another in some communities until the end of the first century. But there seems to be, in some communities, a pronounced shift. There's a document in particular, I'm blanking on the name of it now, but was written in 85, that seems to be a sort of Jewish decree that those professing Christ can no longer worship within the synagogue. And so there seems to be, over this time period, sort of this gradual separating of these two. And as I said before, the same goes for persecution. From the 80s onward, we also begin to see in writings from this time period a much more developed sense of church structure. So you have bishops and elders and deacons. Writings from this time period, for those who lean on the, for denominations who don't recognize women's role as preachers, most of those documents that speak about women aren't allowed to preach come from this time period. If you read through Paul doesn't seem to have any sort of delineation about who could be in what role of leadership. But onward from this point, there is sort of this narrowing of roles in this time period, as there's sort of a consolidating of power, I guess you could call it. Clement becomes Bishop of Rome and is really influential with the kind of really narrowing down of this church hierarchy. And finally, this is notable because it's a sort of extra-biblical record. Within Roman records, Jews and Christians start to be referred to as two separate things. Prior to that, we have no records of them being different outside of kind of internal documents. By the end of the first century, Rome recognizes them as two different belief systems. So, to sum up, the New Testament, as we have it, captures a time period of slightly over a century, from Jesus' birth in 4 BC to writings at the start of the 2nd century. And the entirety of the New Testament can be seen as an extended meditation from different authors and time periods on who was Jesus and how do we understand his role as prophet, teacher, priest, and most importantly, as Messiah. We ask the question of what does Jesus' life, death, and resurrection mean for us in our world, and most of these books are wrestling with what has fundamentally changed because of that. And finally, how are we meant to practice Jesus' teachings as individuals and corporately as a church? I hope I didn't miss anything with that, but for me, looking at the entirety of the New Testament, for me, those are kind of the animating questions from Paul to the gospel writers to others that they are really trying to set out. And yeah, that's, I hope, a decent overview of what is in the New Testament. All right. Woo. So if you have any questions, please come up and ask. I know I left no time for questions whatsoever, but I am happy to answer. So.